In 2004, something very interesting was discovered in the left-hand side of that photograph, about halfway down from what today people call the Spur of Ophel, or the City of David. This is John Moore with Bible Passages, and we're here today to talk about John chapter 9 and the Pool of Siloam. Fascinating discovery, but not just so much from an archaeological perspective, but because of its location and what it teaches us about the blind man whom Jesus put mud on his eyes and told him to go and wash in the Pool of Siloam. Very fascinating about why he told him to go so far and why he had him do what he did. We're going to talk about that just briefly today. But before we do, let's put this in its overall context. This discovery was, as I've mentioned, found somewhere right around here. And the Spur of Ophel, where the Spring of Gihon is located today, brings water through Hezekiah's tunnel over here. We'll see that in just a moment. And at that particular location, during a water main break, and people were sent out to repair that break, they discovered some steps. And so they called archaeologists, particularly Eli Shukran and Ronnie Reich, to excavate this site. And what they found was essentially a pool. The steps associated with it. They discovered these steps here and some that came around this way. And in recent years, there's been even more excavation, though not all the rest of this was found. But what they discovered is what had been long searched for and thought as having once existed up here at a so-called Byzantine pool, was indeed the Pool of Siloam, at least as far as we can tell, from the time of Jesus. A pool that was dated during this time because of what they found in some of the plaster that was used in some of the steps and holding them together were coins that were minted during the Hasmonean period. So roughly 100 or so years before Christ, these coins were minted. And so the pool has to be at least that old. And I believe that it was a pool that was in existence during the time of Jesus and served a number of important functions. Well, the Pool of Siloam is a great, great story, but yet, as I mentioned, something that ought to draw us closer to God when we think about understanding it in its geographical and cultural setting. So let's talk about the background associated with the events of John chapter 9. To do that, we really have to go all the way back to the Old Testament and consider the book of Isaiah. Remember Isaiah and his work and ministry, the prophet Isaiah, took place around the 8th century BC. The Assyrians were invading the land. They'd already taken the northern 10 tribes into captivity, and they were threatening Judah. And so Isaiah was told by God to warn the people that they were going to be disciplined, that they ultimately would be carried away by Babylon, and that they are going to be disciplined. Well, to comfort them in their discipline, God says, look, you're being judged, but other nations are going to be judged. But when you come back, I want you to know there's going to be a restoration period, and I want you to look forward to being restored now, but also that I'm going to keep my promises in sending a Savior, a Messiah, that I had spoken about in 2 Samuel 7, 12 through 14, relative to David and his throne lasting forever. And then all the way back to Genesis 12 through Abraham, all families of the earth being blessed. When you read through the book of Isaiah, you get this distinct impression that there's coming this wonderful age, not only in this life, but then in the consummation of all things, something even greater and far better out on the horizon when this world ends. And so Isaiah writes to remind people of the coming of this messianic kingdom, that all nations would flow into the mountain on the top of the Lord's, on top of all the other mountains in Jerusalem, that all nations would flow into it, that there would be a mighty God, a counselor, the Prince of Peace that would establish his government, Isaiah chapter 9, and that there would come a suffering servant that would fulfill those promises, Isaiah 53. But there's also, and I want you to listen to it now, in Isaiah 29 an important prophetic utterance that is connected to John chapter 9. And it is this, in Isaiah 29, verse 18, that in that day the deaf shall hear the words of a book, and out of their gloom and darkness the eyes of the blind shall see, the meek shall obtain fresh joy in the Lord. In other words, as various hints are unveiled in the book of Isaiah about this golden age, this messianic age that's out on the horizon, one of the ways that you're going to recognize it is this miraculous occurrence of healing in the lives of people. Now, interestingly enough, as far as I'm able to remember, there's no Old Testament passage that speaks about a man who was blind being healed of his blindness. Now, there are other kinds of miracles, of course, in the Old Testament, but none about a blind man. None until you get to the ministry of Jesus. And where you see in particular here in John 9 that he heals a man that was blind that was sitting outside the temple. Now, people in that day and age who must have known about Isaiah and had heard about the prophecies, and as Jesus himself is going to continue to connect the Old Testament to his ministry to show that he is the fulfillment of those prophecies, they must have thought about this event. And we need to think about it as well, because as recorded by John, truly those as prophesied by Isaiah did receive their sight. And then also there is the dawning of this messianic age marked by water, about the salvation that comes through water. And that, as you read in John 7, in this same context of where Jesus is at the temple, that the water that was poured out as a drink offering on the altar there at the end of the Feast of Tabernacles, Jesus makes a connection to the water that he gives and the Holy Spirit that would come, that would be a refreshment to them, as it were. And then let's notice this, that there is the dawning of this age that was marked by water, but also knowing something about the location, the meaning of the word Siloam, where this miracle took place, and the geography of it itself to better appreciate what we're reading about. So let's talk about quickly the word itself. The name of the pool, as identified in John chapter 9, is, in the Greek language, translated in English, Siloam. Well, Siloam is Greek, or at least a form of a Greek word that seems to be transliterated out of an Old Testament usage of a word, Shiloah. And that word is referenced in a couple of places, and through deduction you can sort of put together the references to the spring of Gihon coming out of the spur of Ophel and then channeling through this tunnel built by Hezekiah to empty into a pool to bring water into the inside, as we'll see in just a moment, to the city. That those waters were rejected. That became a symbolic reference to the rejection of God. They would reject waters that were sent from the Gihon spring? Absolutely not, but they're going to reject God. So this word Shiloah then is interpreted by John to Siloam, or is translated and spoken of in this way, and the word itself means to send. Indeed, a part of that Hebrew idea associated with ascending or going of some sort of the gushing of the Gihon spring, and then the flowing of water from that spring to fill up a pool, a reservoir down below, is an important symbol that Jesus is going to use about himself being sent from God and sending this man then to be healed at the pool of Siloam. So, number one, the name, it means to send or sent. And then secondly, we need to quickly know something about the geography to better appreciate where this pool is and what this pool is. So remember, in a previous lesson, we talked about the topography of Jerusalem, and that it started, at least the civilization started right here on this eastern hill, this finger-like structure jutting out into the south here, bordered on either side by valleys, and then the western hill over here, so that, as you see in a lot of Bible maps, represented here, the city of David, what's once was a Jebusite city, became David's city, built a palace, purchased the threshing floor up here where Solomon built the temple. And then over time, that city is going to expand westward. And it particularly did during the days of Uzziah and Hezekiah in the divided kingdom period, roughly around the 9th century BC. So as it's expanding westward, and evidently as some of the refugees from the northern 10 tribes maybe even made their way down into this area, the city then needs a wall built around it. So as it builds this wall, and as Hezekiah builds this wall around it, they've got a problem. How are they going to get their water? The main water source for many, many years had been the spring of Gihon and a series of reservoirs that had been built over here, as well as I think others that came down from the pool of Bethesda, or at least the Bethesda Valley in some way. But this was the main water source. So now how do we bring that water, protect our water over here from enemies invading? David got in, I think, through some sort of gutter, some sort of shaft that allowed him to penetrate the city and get inside, at least Joab and his men did, to take it from the Jebusites. And so maybe they remembered that, and they're going to protect that and bring water in a tunnel over here into the Central Valley so that the citizens on that side could have a water source. But that water source also became a place where ritualistic bathing occurred. Remember, under the old law, that there was a lot of washing required to be ritualistically cleansed or ceremonially cleansed under the old law. And so by the time of Jesus especially, there was the practice of immersion before you went up to the temple. One might immerse themselves or stop here and participate in some sort of religious ceremony, or as we're going to see in just a moment, the priest would come down here on the final day of Sukkot and this tabernacle of the booths and get water here and carry it back to the temple. So a lot of Jews would start here and work their way up, as we'll see in a moment. But there was a reservoir built here, and you can see, especially in this particular illustration done by Patrick Hammock in our Bible Land passages, and with Matt Cain in the video series on Hezekiah's tunnel. You ought to go watch that to better understand some of the things we're talking about here. But notice that under this eastern hill then, the water was dumped into that valley where a pool was made. And here you can see a better sort of aerial shot of that. The Gihon Spring, the tunnel dug, empties water over there, and you have this large reservoir for watering purposes, for homes, drinking, but also for ritualistic bathing. So the pool of Siloam that was discovered here again just a few years ago, that is located in the Central Valley, can be visited today, and that's where it is in relationship to some of the modern buildings. And you can see then, notice this, very important, that we're going to kind of focus on in a moment. Notice the elevation change, that you have the Temple Mount, and then we're going to go down, 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 down to the Pool of Siloam. So the elevation begins to drop, especially in that valley area. Here's another example of what we're talking about in terms of a map. Here's the temple, and then right down here is the Pool of Siloam. And then notice this from illustrations found when you visit the city of David today, and you can buy a map there, or there are a number of places along the route as you visit some of these sites in the city of David. This is an artist's impression of what it was like during the time of Jesus, that you had this exterior wall with this reservoir here, and we now know today it was probably more like a dam with steps going in on this side, because the steps have not been found over here. They could have been there and then taken away, we don't know, but probably more of a dam. And then this water dammed up in here, and people would come here and then go up Pilgrim's Way and ascend up to the temple. It was quite a popular thing to do to come to that particular pool, waters that were sent from the Gihon spring through Hezekiah's tunnel down to this particular pool. And here is another artist illustration of what that pool may have been look like, with two little Jewish boys here, maybe coming while mom and dad are going through their ceremonial practices, or maybe they've come down there to get water to take back to their homes. And so when Ronnie Reich and Ilan Shukran excavated here, this is what they found. Now, all of this has been excavated lately, but this is basically what was discovered, and what you can go and visit today and sit here, and a lot of people do, and have devotionals and talk about some of the things that I'm going to share with you in just a moment. And here is from that lower section. We now know today it goes down deeper, but imagine people walking down in here, maybe at times of year when the water was a little bit lower, you could get down closer to it. Maybe the water would rise and you'd have a landing up there where you could sit, or where you could get down into the water for ritualistic purposes, or to get your water to take home. And then here's another example of it. Right here on the southern end then of the spur of Ophel, walking up the Pilgrim's Way, as it's called today, to get up into the temple complex. So that is the geographical background of this story. The name Siloam means sent. It's the dawning of the Messianic age that we need to be looking for, and prophecies made about the blind receiving their sight. And then the other thing associated with this particular event that's so important is what's mentioned in chapter 7, and that is the final day of this celebration of the Tabernacles. So if you turn to John chapter 7 and notice now, as we had noted in a previous Land and Book episode, that verse 37 says that it was on the last day of the feast, that is this Feast of Tabernacles, or Sukkot, in other words, like a tent or a dwelling place of some sort. And on that last day of the feast, the great day, Jesus stood up and he cried out. Now there were 7 days, and then on the 8th day there was to be a special day of convocation, a full day of resting. Sometimes it fell on the Sabbath, sometimes it didn't. But it was like a Sabbath. So we bring our offerings throughout the week, and we have these celebrations. But on this 8th day, there are food offerings, but there is also a day to rest and a day to think reflectively about our relationship with God. The names for this feast, as I have been talking about, is Sukkot, the plural form of Sukkah, a tent or a hut. Both a temporary type of tent, had reference to a tabernacle, and the Torah, now notice this, also refers to this as the festival of ingathering. It's the harvest festival. It marks the end of the growing season for that year. It's sort of like their Thanksgiving. They've come to the end of their growing season. The rainy season has been done, and now we're looking forward to it to start up here pretty quick. And so we're concerned about that. We need the rain because we're going to plant new crops. We want more water to come and to fill up our cisterns and all of that. So this is an important time of the year. Feast requirements that I mentioned in the previous session were a pilgrimage, there were festivities, and there was this holy convocation on the 8th day. All right, and what else happened on that 8th day? Remember, in that previous session, we talked about a drink offering. That on the 8th day, they came, priests did, to the pool of Siloam, and in special vessels, they carried water back up this half-mile journey, up, all the way into the inner sanctuary, where they would pour out that water upon the altar. Symbolic, perhaps, of I'm pouring out my life to you, God. I'm giving everything to you. We're recognizing maybe where our source of sustenance and our water comes from. We're about to get into this rainy season. Lord, we need the rain because it only comes 2 times of the year, right? The early rain and the latter rain. And we need that latter rain. And so this became an important part of this Feast of Ingathering, to recognize that we give everything to God because He's given everything to us. The second thing, and now this is again very important, especially with regard to this blind man, is that this festival was connected to the illumination of a ceremony at the temple, or to the lights at the temple. At Sukkot, there were great and important festivities associated with these candles, or these lights that were in the court of the women. The Mishnah tells us about that this court area had these fantastic lights, and oil was put in them, and they would burn, and the whole city would be able to see basically at night because of the brilliance coming from those lamps. And basically, it said that men of piety and good deeds would dance before these lighted torches in their hands, singing songs and praises, and the Levites with harps and lyres and cymbals and trumpets. And so there was a lot of festivity and a lot of rejoicing going on. Remember now, John 7 tells us that it is the last day of the feast. And on the last day of the feast, these candelabras, these menorahs, whatever it is, these lights are extinguished. They're put out that night. And so it is then that Jesus goes to the Mount of Olives in John chapter 8, remember, as we said in a previous session, and he comes back the next morning. The lights are out, as it were, at the temple there. Those lights have been put out. And now Jesus goes and he teaches in the temple. And as he, according to chapter 9, is leaving the temple. Now notice in John chapter 9, verse 1, that as he passed by, he saw a man from birth. Because the Bible says, John chapter 8, verse 58, that he hid himself and he went out of the temple when they were trying to stone him. He claimed to be God because he was God. Before Abraham was, I am, he says. And so he's going out of the temple, which I think probably that meant somewhere on the southern end where this blind man would have been. We don't know 100% for certain, but it's a likely location for a man who was lame to sit as right here where so many people were going in. And so he's going out of the temple. Chapter 9, verse 1, he passes by and he saw a man blind from birth. And his disciples asked him, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? And Jesus answered, it was not that this man sinned or his parents, but that the works of God might be displayed in him. We must work the works of him who sent me while it is day. Night is coming when no man can work. As long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world. See, not the menorahs, they've been put out, but I'm the light of the world. You're looking for light. You're looking, as God came to represent light even in the Old Testament. Jesus says, I am that light. Having said these things, then he spit on the ground and he made mud with it, and he anointed the man's eyes with the mud. And he said to him, go wash in the pool of Siloam, which means sent. So he went and he washed and he came back seeing. When Jesus did this, he was doing so many things, one of which was to show that if you want to see, don't close your eyes and your hearts like the Pharisees did in rejecting him, but open your eyes and your hearts to see that Jesus is the fulfillment of these prophecies made back in Isaiah, that he is in fact the Son of God. Open your eyes and see, for even those who are poor, those who are maimed by some malady, they can both literally see and spiritually see, as we're going to see in just a moment from what is said in the text about what this man testifies about Jesus. So this event of Jesus healing a man at the end of the feast is over, putting mud on his eyes, sending him down to the pool of Siloam, is a fulfillment of the things that we were talking about in Isaiah. You're looking for this Messianic age. Isaiah had foretold it. It's going to include things like the blind receiving their sight. And right here in Jerusalem, as recorded by John, who wrote these things down about what others were seeing and what he no doubt saw to some degree himself, wrote these things down as a testimony to give us a certainty and a knowledge of the fact that Jesus is who he says he is, the Son of God. He is the light of the world. He is what brings sight to those who are blind, both physically, but more importantly, spiritually. He brings light to a world in darkness. And according to John 9:17, this then proves that he is the prophet. Notice what is said when this blind man is questioned by the council. They said again to the blind man, "What do you say about him?" Talking about Jesus. "Since he opened your eyes." And he said, "He is a prophet." He opened your eyes. Well, what does that mean? He's a prophet. And we know that, as Nicodemus said earlier in John, no man can do these things except God be with him. So it's powerful testimony, one among many signs, miracles, confirmation that's given as testified by John that Jesus is the Christ and that this is the inauguration of this Messianic age. The last thing, and I think that is so helpful and encouraging in so many ways by way of application, is number one, when we read this story, what is it that we say? If we're asked today, knowing that we're reading and we're understanding and we're being enlightened, as it were, and we're seeing the light of the gospel, what conclusions does it lead us to? And can we show to others why we believe what we believe? Here is the testimony of a man who was blind and was healed. John writes about it. And we today can use this testimony as well to help not only convince ourselves and convict us, but to share with others that this was a man, Jesus, like no other. But the second thing I want us to think about is this, in relationship to this powerful story. Are you willing to trust Jesus even when it's hard and maybe seems unfair? Now, have you ever wondered why it is that this man was told to walk over a half a mile down a steep incline through masses of people that were probably making their way up to the temple, where there were shops and houses and people were selling their wares, and now this man has to walk a half mile and go down here to this pool and wipe off mud off his face so he can see? I mean, it must have been a spectacle, don't you think? First of all, imagine the feeling of that. He's blind, he doesn't know, and all of a sudden he feels this cold, wet yuckiness on his eyes. He asks Jesus. He wants to talk to Jesus. And yet that's what he gets. Mud on his eyes. And now he has to walk a half mile down to this pool and wash. Maybe if he had heard about a man at the pool of Bethesda, just north of the temple complex, that was told, "Do you want to be healed? Yes, take up your bed. Walk. Get up." And that's all he had to do. And now this man has to go through all this extra effort. You ever wonder why that's the case? You ever wonder why maybe some people's prayers seems like they're answered right away, and others maybe not for a long time, or maybe not even at all? I don't always know why God does what he does and the way he does it. But I know in this case that maybe this man needed to demonstrate a greater faith in God besides just calling out to him in some way. But more than that, maybe this man, as we are learning today, was being used by God as a great testimony to show forth the works of God, that a man who probably drew a lot of attention had to walk a long ways against the crowd, mud on his eyes. People may be saying things about him, and yet he did it in faith. What a testament to great faith that says, you know what, I don't know why I've got to do this. I don't even understand it all, but I'm going to do what the Lord asked me to do. And I'm going to make that journey. And it may be a while before I get what it is that I'm wanting, and that is healing. But God, I'm going to trust you. Because ultimately, where I'm going for the healing is a reminder of the fact that as Jesus tells us that he was in fact sent by God, that he was a prophet sent by God, and go to a pool where waters were sent from the Gihon spring to refresh you. Oh, what great faith he had. And that we also need to remember that sometimes it may take a while. Sometimes we may have to go through some things before we get an answer or the healing that we want. But hang in there, because Jesus' promises are certain. As we're walking down a long road of life, we can trust in the Lord. And we need to remember that at the pool of Siloam, the place where a man was healed and was able to see, so we can see through the light of the gospel of God's word, through the powerful work of Jesus Christ. There's light into the world. Our eyes are open. We see things differently, clearer. We're not in darkness, but there's hope. There's excitement. There's joy. And we then, like this man, can be a testament then to the fact that Jesus is a prophet.